Patricia Kalitsky. In January 1956, near Great Falls, Montana, 18-year-old airman Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and 16-year-old Patricia Kalitsky went on what should have been an ordinary date. The young couple was last seen at a local drive-in theater, enjoying an evening together in the small Montana community. Neither would return home alive. The following day, hikers discovered Bogle's body near his vehicle. He had been shot in the head, and his hands were bound. The scene indicated a violent confrontation with someone who had come prepared to cause harm. A search for Patricia began immediately, and her body was found the next day, also shot, with evidence indicating she had been harmed before her death. The investigation in 1956 faced significant challenges. Forensic science was in its infancy compared to modern standards. There were no witnesses to the incident, and the remote location provided few clues about who might have approached the couple. Detectives interviewed dozens of individuals, but could not identify a suspect with sufficient evidence to pursue charges. What investigators did accomplish, however, would prove crucial more than 6 decades later. A forensic sample was collected from Patricia's body and preserved according to protocols of that era. This biological evidence was stored as the case went cold, joining thousands of other unsolved files across the country. The case remained dormant for decades. Detectives who had worked the original investigation retired or passed away. Families of the victims lived with unanswered questions about who had taken their loved ones and why. The community of Great Falls moved on, though the case was never officially closed. In 2001, the preserved sample was tested using DNA technology that had developed since the original investigation. Scientists were able to develop a genetic profile, but it matched no one in existing databases. The profile sat in evidence, waiting for the right breakthrough. That breakthrough came in 2019, when Bode Technology, a forensic laboratory specializing in genetic genealogy, took on the case. Using the DNA profile developed from the 1956 sample, scientists uploaded the genetic information to public genealogy databases. They then built what is called a reverse family tree, identifying relatives of the unknown individual and working backward to find potential matches. The genealogical research pointed to Kenneth Gould, a man who had lived in the Great Falls area in 1956. Gould had no known connection to either victim and had led what appeared to be an ordinary life. He had moved to Missouri in 1967 and had passed away in 2007, more than a decade before the DNA match was made. To confirm the identification, investigators obtained DNA samples from Gould's children who cooperated with the investigation. The familial DNA matched the profile from the crime scene, providing scientific confirmation that Gould had been present during the attack on Patricia. The family was shocked by the revelation, having had no indication of such an act in their father's past. Because Gould had died before the identification was made, no trial or formal prosecution could occur. The case was resolved in the sense that the perpetrator was identified, but traditional legal accountability was impossible. Detective John Cadner, who worked on the resolution, expressed the significance of the breakthrough, noting that for the first time in 65 years, they finally had a direction. The motive behind the attacks on Patricia and Lloyd remains unknown. Investigators found no evidence of robbery or any prior connection between Gould and the victims. The case appears to have been an act of opportunity, though without the ability to question Gould, this remains speculation. Another case from the early 1960s would also require decades before answers emerged: Wayne Pratt. On June 12, 1963, 24-year-old Wayne Pratt was working his shift at an Enco gas station in Winnebago County, Wisconsin. Pratt was found by his wife, covered by a blanket, having sustained 53 stab wounds. The severity of the attack shocked investigators, as the number of wounds suggested intense rage or desperation, rather than a simple robbery gone wrong. The crime scene revealed that the attacker had also been injured during the confrontation. Blood at the scene included samples from someone other than Pratt, indicating the perpetrator had cut themselves, possibly during the struggle. This evidence was collected and preserved, though the technology to analyze it effectively did not yet exist. Initial investigation in 1963 identified a person of interest. William Dockstader, who lived in Boulder, Wisconsin, was on parole for breaking and entering at the time of the incident. He had been seen near the gas station and was known to be acquainted with Pratt. However, investigators could not develop sufficient evidence to charge him, and the case went cold after 1968. The investigation was reopened in 2011 as part of cold case review efforts. The blanket that had covered Pratt's body was sent for DNA analysis. However, the sample presented challenges because it contained a mixture of DNA from multiple individuals, making traditional analysis difficult. In 2015, Sorensen Forensics attempted to separate the mixture, but the results were inconclusive. The case appeared to have reached another dead end. Tips continued to come in periodically, including one from a psychic in 2017. But none provided actionable leads. The breakthrough came in 2023 and 2024 when Cybergenetics, a laboratory specializing in complex DNA mixtures, applied advanced software to analyze the blanket evidence. Their technology was able to separate the individual contributors to the mixture and develop distinct profiles. One of these profiles matched William Dockstader, the original person of interest from 1963. Dockstader had died in 2022, meaning he could not be questioned or prosecuted. However, the DNA evidence provided the confirmation that had eluded investigators for 6 decades. In a 2018 interview, before the DNA match was made, Dockstader had denied involvement, but admitted to frequent visits to the gas station where Pratt worked. District Attorney Eric Spar stated that there would be sufficient evidence to support a homicide charge if Dockstader were still alive. The case was officially resolved in July 2024, 61 years after Pratt's passing. The excessive nature of the attack, 53 stab wounds, suggested the incident was more than a simple robbery, though the specific motive died with Dockstader. For Pratt's family, the resolution brought closure after decades of waiting. The case highlighted how advances in DNA mixture analysis could resolve cases that had seemed scientifically impossible to solve just years earlier. What happens when the evidence points to someone who worked in the very building where the crime occurred? Susan Galvin. In July 1967, 20-year-old Susan Galvin worked as a clerk for the Seattle Police Department in Washington State. She was found in an elevator at a Seattle Center parking garage, having been attacked and strangled. The discovery of a police department employee in such circumstances prompted an extensive investigation. The crime scene yielded biological evidence that was collected from Galvin's clothing. Investigators preserved this material according to protocols of the era, recognizing its potential value, even though the technology to fully analyze it did not yet exist. Despite extensive efforts, including interviews with hundreds of potential witnesses and suspects, the case went cold. For 52 years, the identity of Susan's attacker remained unknown. Her family lived with questions that seemed destined to remain unanswered. Her brother Lorimer grew up without ever knowing who had taken his sister or why. The breakthrough came through genetic genealogy. In 2018, investigators partnered with Parabon Nano Labs, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. DNA extracted from the preserved evidence was uploaded to public genealogy databases, and researchers began building family trees based on genetic matches. The genealogical research revealed that the unknown DNA had characteristics consistent with Polish and Native American ancestry. This information helped narrow the search, and eventually, investigators identified a potential match. Frank Wypich, a man who had worked as a security guard at Seattle Center, the same complex where Susan's body was found. Wypich had died in 1987, decades before the DNA analysis. To confirm the identification, investigators obtained a court order to exhume his remains. DNA extracted from the exhumed body matched the profile from the crime scene, providing scientific confirmation of his involvement. Detective Rolf Norton, who worked on the cold case resolution, stated that investigators were 100% certain they had identified Susan's attacker. He praised the original investigators who had preserved the evidence that made the identification possible more than 5 decades later. The motive behind the attack on Susan remains unknown. Wypich had no documented criminal history prior to this incident, and there was no evidence of any connection between him and Susan. His position as a security guard would have given him access to the parking garage where the crime occurred, potentially enabling an opportunistic attack. Susan's brother Lorimer expressed the complex emotions that came with the resolution, stating that 52 years later they learned who was responsible, but still had no clear understanding as to why. This sentiment reflects the reality of many cold case resolutions. DNA can identify a perpetrator, but cannot explain their motivations, especially when they are deceased and cannot be questioned, because Wypich died. Before the identification, no trial or formal prosecution occurred. The case was resolved in terms of identifying the responsible party. But traditional legal accountability was impossible. Investigators found no evidence linking Wypich to any other unsolved incidents, though reviews of similar cases in the area continue. Sometimes the perpetrator lived even closer to the victim, Nancy Benelak. In October 1970, 28-year-old Nancy Benelak returned to her apartment in Sacramento, California. Nancy worked as a court reporter and was engaged to a local public defender. She was looking forward to her upcoming wedding and building a life with her fiancé. That evening would be her last. Nancy was attacked in her apartment and stabbed more than 30 times. The severity of the attack was extreme, and the medical examination revealed the brutal nature of what had occurred. However, the perpetrator had made a critical error during the assault. They had cut themselves, leaving their own blood mixed with Nancy's at the crime scene. This blood trail would eventually prove to be the key to solving the case. Though investigators in 1970 lacked the technology to analyze it effectively. The samples were collected and preserved, joining the evidence file as the investigation pursued traditional leads. Initial investigations focused on Nancy's personal and professional life. As a court reporter, she interacted with many individuals involved in the legal system, and investigators explored whether any of these connections might explain the attack. No clear suspect emerged, and the case went cold. In 2004, DNA technology had advanced sufficiently to develop a genetic profile from the perpetrator's blood. This profile was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database, but it matched no one in the system. Familial DNA searches, which look for relatives of an unknown profile, were attempted but also failed to produce results. The breakthrough came in 2019 through genetic genealogy. Investigators used the DNA profile to search public genealogy databases and build family trees. The genealogical research eventually identified relatives of the unknown profile, leading investigators to Richard John Davis. Davis had been Nancy's neighbor, living in the same apartment complex. He had lived just steps away from her unit, with access to common areas and potentially to information about her schedule and habits. The proximity between victim and perpetrator was striking, highlighting how someone so close could have committed such an act without detection. Davis had died in 1997, more than 2 decades before the DNA identification. He had never been a suspect during the original investigation, and there is no record of him being interviewed or considered in connection with the case. His death meant that no trial or prosecution could occur. District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert announced the resolution of the case, stating that Nancy was never forgotten. The case represented the oldest cold case solved in Sacramento County history at that time. Nancy's sister Linda expressed gratitude to investigators who had continued working on the case for nearly 50 years. The motive behind the attack remains unknown. Davis had no documented criminal history, and investigators found no evidence of any prior connection or conflict between him and Nancy. The case appears to have been opportunistic, though without the ability to question Davis, this remains speculation. Another case from Canada would reveal a similar pattern of someone who harmed and then vanished. Yvonne LaRue. In November 1972, in the Toronto area of Ontario, Canada, 16-year-old Yvonne LaRue was reported missing. Her body was subsequently discovered in King Township, north of the city. The medical examination revealed she had been subjected to blunt force trauma before her life was taken. Her body had been transported and left in the rural area, indicating planning on the part of the perpetrator. The investigation in 1972 pursued every available lead. Yvonne's movements before her disappearance were traced, and anyone who might have seen her or had contact with her was interviewed. Despite these efforts, no suspect could be identified, and the case eventually went cold. For 50 years, Yvonne's family lived without answers about what had happened to her. York Regional Police maintained the case file, periodically reviewing the evidence as forensic technology advanced. The department's commitment to unsolved cases meant that Yvonne was never forgotten by investigators, even as decades passed. The breakthrough came in 2022 through investigative genetic genealogy. DNA evidence that had been preserved from the crime scene was analyzed and uploaded to genealogy databases. The resulting family tree research identified relatives of the unknown profile, leading investigators to Bruce Charles Cantillon. Cantillon had a documented history of offenses involving harm to women and had been incarcerated for mental health issues. His background suggested a pattern of concerning behavior that predated his involvement with Yvonne. Investigators found no evidence that he had known Yvonne prior to the incident, suggesting a random encounter that turned deadly. However, bringing Cantillon to justice was impossible. He had taken his own life in 1974, just 2 years after Yvonne's passing and nearly 5 decades before the DNA identification. His death came before any suspicion had focused on him in connection with the case. To confirm the identification, investigators worked with Cantillon's relatives, who cooperated with the investigation by providing DNA samples for comparison. The familial match confirmed that the DNA from the crime scene belonged to Cantillon, providing scientific certainty about his involvement. Deputy Chief Alvaro Almeida of York Regional Police described the perpetrator's actions as cruel and ruthless. The manner in which Yvonne's body had been left in a rural area, away from where she had disappeared, demonstrated a callousness that disturbed investigators even 5 decades later. Yvonne's family released a statement through York Regional Police, expressing that she was far from forgotten. The identification provided answers to questions they had carried for 50 years, though it could not restore what had been taken from them. The resolution allowed them to know who was responsible, even if traditional justice was impossible. Cantillon's death shortly after the crime raises questions about whether his mental state deteriorated further after what he did to Yvonne. Investigators found no evidence linking him to other unsolved cases, though reviews of incidents from that era continue. The next case would involve a couple whose lives ended in their own home. Linda Bernhardt. In November 1973, 24-year-old Linda Bernhardt and her husband Clifford, also 24, were found in their home in Billings, Montana. Both had been strangled, and Linda had been subjected to an attack before her passing. The double homicide shocked the Montana community and launched an extensive investigation. The crime scene yielded biological evidence that was collected and preserved. Investigators pursued leads based on the couple's personal and professional lives, looking for anyone who might have had motive or opportunity. The focus on Linda suggested that she may have been the primary target, with Clifford harmed because he was present. Investigation revealed that Cecil Stan Caldwell had been Linda's co-worker. He had moved to Billings in 1964 and worked at a warehouse where Linda was also employed. This connection placed him in proximity to the victim, though at the time, investigators could not develop sufficient evidence to pursue charges. Caldwell had no documented criminal history, and without physical evidence linking him to the scene, the case went cold. In 2004, advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to develop a genetic profile from evidence collected at the crime scene. This profile was entered into CODIS, but matched no one in the database. Traditional investigative methods had reached their limits, and the case remained unsolved. The breakthrough came through genetic genealogy between 2018 and 2019. Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy, analyzed the DNA profile and built family trees using public genealogy databases. The research identified relatives of the unknown profile, and investigators focused on Cecil Stan Caldwell as the likely match. To confirm the identification, investigators obtained DNA from Caldwell's brother, who cooperated with the investigation. The familial DNA matched the profile from the crime scene, providing scientific confirmation of Caldwell's involvement. The workplace connection between Caldwell and Linda added context to how he may have identified her as a target. Caldwell had died in 2003, 16 years before the DNA identification. He had never been publicly named as a suspect during the original investigation, and there is no record of him being questioned in connection with the case. His death meant no trial or formal prosecution could occur. Sheriff Mike Linder expressed satisfaction at being able to bring answers to the families after so many years. Cold Case Coordinator Monty Wallace described genetic genealogy as the gold standard for solving such cases, highlighting how the technology had transformed what was possible in long-dormant investigations. The motive behind the attack on the Bernhardts remains unknown. Caldwell had no documented history of concerning behavior, and investigators found no evidence of conflict between him and either victim. The workplace connection suggests he may have developed an unhealthy interest in Linda, but without the ability to question him, this remains speculation. Investigators reviewed other unsolved cases from the era to determine if Caldwell might have been involved in additional incidents, but found no evidence linking him to other crimes. The case highlighted how someone with no criminal history could commit such acts and then continue living an unremarkable life for decades afterward. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. One case would stand apart from the others, not because of DNA evidence, but because of confessions that took decades to lead to a courtroom. Irene Garza. In April 1960, 25-year-old Irene Garza was a beloved teacher in McAllen, Texas. She was known throughout her community for her dedication to her students and her deep faith. On the evening before Easter, Irene went to Sacred Heart Catholic Church to make her confession, a common practice for devout Catholics before the Holy Day. She would never return home. When Irene failed to appear for Easter services the following day, her family reported her missing. A search began immediately, involving community members, local authorities, and volunteers who knew and loved the young teacher. 5 days later, Irene's body was discovered in a canal. The medical examination revealed she had been attacked and suffocated. Evidence at the scene indicated she had been harmed before her passing. The investigation focused on the last place Irene had been seen alive, the church where she had gone to confession. A young priest named John Feet had been the one to hear Irene's confession that evening. When questioned, Feet provided inconsistent accounts of his movements and had visible scratches on his hands that he struggled to explain. A slide viewer belonging to Irene was later found in a canal, providing circumstantial evidence of Feet's involvement. Despite the suspicions surrounding Feet, no charges were filed for Irene's death at the time. However, just weeks after Irene's passing, Feet was charged with attacking another woman named Maria America Guerra at a different church. He pleaded no contest to this charge and received a fine, but served no prison time. The church subsequently moved Feet to other locations, effectively shielding him from further scrutiny in Irene's case. What made this case unique was that the breakthrough would come not from DNA evidence, but from confessions that Feet made over the years. Feet confessed to 2 different clergy members, Dale Tatchaney and Father Joseph O'Brien, that he had attacked Irene after hearing her confession and suffocated her. These confessions were known to church officials, but were not reported to law enforcement for decades. In 2002, investigators attempted to use DNA evidence from the original case. However, because Irene's body had been submerged in canal water for 5 days, no viable DNA could be recovered. The case would have to rely on testimonial evidence rather than forensic science. For over 50 years, Irene's family fought for justice. Her relative Noemi Ponce Sigler became a vocal advocate for reopening the case, stating that Feet could not be allowed to get away with what he had done. The family's persistence, combined with changing attitudes about holding powerful institutions accountable, eventually led to renewed interest in the case. In 2016, more than 56 years after Irene's death, John Feet was finally arrested. He had long since left the priesthood, married, had children, and was living in Arizona, where he volunteered with a Catholic organization. His arrest brought the case back into public attention and raised questions about why justice had taken so long. The trial took place in 2017, and Feet was convicted of taking Irene's life with malice. The prosecution relied heavily on the confessions Feet had made to the clergy members, as well as circumstantial evidence from the original investigation. Feet maintained his innocence throughout, stating he was not the man who had harmed Irene. He was sentenced to life in prison. Feet died in prison in 2020 from cardiac issues while an appeal was still pending. His death meant the legal process ended without a final appellate ruling. For Irene's family, the conviction had provided a measure of justice, though it came too late for many who had known and loved her. The Garza case stands apart from other cold case resolutions because DNA evidence played no role in the conviction. Instead, it was the confessions Feet made to fellow clergy, combined with the circumstantial evidence from the original investigation, that ultimately led to his conviction. The case demonstrated that even without forensic breakthroughs, persistence and changed societal attitudes toward institutional accountability could eventually lead to justice. Another case would involve evidence that pointed to someone still potentially alive: Margaret Peggy Beck. In August 1963, 16-year-old Margaret Beck, known as Peggy, was serving as a counselor at a Girl Scout camp in Deckers, Colorado. Peggy was described by her sisters as a beautiful young person who loved life and was dedicated to working with the younger scouts at the camp. The remote mountain location was considered safe, a place where girls could enjoy nature and develop leadership skills. One night, someone entered Peggy's tent and attacked her. She was harmed and strangled. her life taken while other campers slept nearby. The discovery of her body the following morning sent shockwaves through the camp and the broader community. How had someone accessed this remote location and committed such an act without being detected? The investigation in 1963 faced significant challenges. The camp's isolation meant few potential witnesses, and the perpetrator had left limited evidence behind. Interviews with camp staff, visitors, and anyone who had been in the area produced no clear suspect. The case went cold, leaving Peggy's family without answers. What investigators did recover was biological evidence from under Peggy's fingernails, suggesting she had fought back against her attacker. This material was preserved, though the technology to analyze it effectively would not exist for decades. In 2007, advances in DNA technology allowed scientists to develop a genetic profile from the fingernail evidence. This profile was entered into databases but matched no one in the system. The case remained unsolved, though the DNA evidence provided hope that identification might eventually be possible. The breakthrough came in 2019 through genetic genealogy. United Data Connect, a company specializing in forensic genealogy, analyzed the DNA profile and built family trees using public databases. The research identified relatives of the unknown profile, and investigators narrowed their focus to a man named James Raymond Taylor. Taylor had lived in Colorado in the early 1960s and worked as a television repairman in Edgewater. His work would have given him mobility throughout the region, including access to remote areas like the Girl Scout camp. He had no documented criminal history prior to this identification, making him an unlikely suspect in the original investigation. Unlike most cold cases resolved through genetic genealogy, Taylor's current status remains uncertain. He was last known to be in Las Vegas in 1976, but his whereabouts since then are unknown. If still alive, he would be in his mid-80s. A warrant was issued for his arrest in 2020, and he remains a fugitive. Jefferson County Sheriff Jeff Schrader expressed the department's commitment to finding Taylor, stating that nothing would give them greater pleasure than putting handcuffs on him. The case remains technically open, with investigators following any leads about Taylor's possible location or whether he is still alive. For Peggy's sisters, the identification provided answers they had waited more than 50 years to receive. They finally knew who had taken their sister, even if bringing him to justice remained elusive. They remembered Peggy as someone full of life and potential, whose future was stolen by someone who has never been held accountable. As of late 2025, no updates have been reported regarding Taylor's location or arrest. The case represents one of the few genetic genealogy identifications where the suspect may still be alive and potentially facing prosecution if found. Metro Denver Crime Stoppers continues to list the case as active, seeking any information about Taylor's whereabouts or whether he is still living. The Beck case highlights both the promise and frustration of cold case investigation. While genetic genealogy successfully identified the perpetrator after more than 50 years, bringing him to justice requires locating someone who may have spent decades avoiding detection. The warrant remains active, and investigators continue to pursue any leads that might reveal where Taylor went after 1976. Sometimes the key evidence was not DNA at all. Everett Delano. In September 1966, 49-year-old Everett Delano was working at a gas station in Andover, New Hampshire. Delano was shot 3 times during what investigators determined was a robbery that netted between $75 and $100. The severity of the attack, shooting a man over such a small amount of money, suggested the perpetrator was willing to eliminate a witness rather than leave someone who could identify them. The investigation in 1966 collected physical evidence from the scene, including fingerprints from a faucet in the station's bathroom. However, Fingerprint databases were limited in that era, and the prints could not be matched to anyone in the system. Without an identification, the case went cold. For decades, the fingerprints sat in evidence, periodically checked against expanding databases as technology improved. The case remained unsolved through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000 era. The breakthrough came in 2013 when the fingerprints were run through IAFIS, the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. The system had grown to include millions of prints from across the country, and this time, a match was found. Thomas Cass. Cass had an extensive criminal history spanning decades. Between 1966 and 2000, he had accumulated 13 convictions for offenses including theft, armed robbery, assault, prison escapes, and other charges. His pattern of criminal behavior was consistent with someone who would commit a robbery and eliminate a witness. He had grown up in a difficult household with an abusive, alcoholic father. Circumstances that some researchers associate with later criminal behavior. When investigators approached Cass in 2013, he denied any involvement in Delano's death. However, his ex-wife provided a different perspective, describing him as a crook who had bragged about various criminal exploits over the years. The fingerprint evidence placed him definitively at the scene, contradicting his denials. Before charges could be formally filed, Cass took his own life in 2014 after police visited him regarding the case. His death meant that no trial would occur, though the fingerprint evidence had conclusively identified him as the person who had been present at the gas station during the robbery and shooting. Delano's family expressed gratitude for the resolution, stating they were happy that the day had come when they received a small measure of justice. The identification came nearly 50 years after Everett's death, too late for many family members who had passed away without knowing who was responsible. The case demonstrated that not all cold case resolutions depend on DNA evidence. Traditional forensic methods like fingerprint analysis, combined with expanded databases and persistent investigation, could also provide answers to families who had waited decades. The New Hampshire Department of Justice announced the resolution, emphasizing their commitment to pursuing justice regardless of how much time had passed. Cass's decision to end his own life after police contact suggested he knew the evidence against him was insurmountable. His decades of criminal activity following Delano's death showed someone who had continued offending without consequence until the fingerprint match finally caught up with him. The case served as a reminder that evidence preserved from decades-old crimes could still lead to identification when matched against modern databases. The next case would reveal the work of someone who had harmed before. Wendy Jo Hallison. In September 1968, 22-year-old Wendy Jo Hallison was an art student living in Los Angeles, California. On the day of her death, she had been shopping and was returning home. She never made it back to her apartment. Wendy Jo was found strangled and attacked, the victim of an opportunistic encounter with someone who crossed her path that day. The investigation in 1968 collected biological evidence from the crime scene, including material that could potentially identify the perpetrator. However, DNA analysis did not exist in 1968, and the evidence was simply preserved as the case pursued traditional investigative leads. Without witnesses or other evidence pointing to a specific individual, the case went cold. For nearly 5 decades, Wendy Jo's case remained unsolved. Her family lived with unanswered questions about who had taken her life and why. The evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology that could unlock its secrets. In 2016, DNA technology had advanced to the point where the preserved evidence could be analyzed. Scientists developed a genetic profile and ran it through databases. This time there was a match: Edwin Dean Richardson. Richardson was no stranger to the criminal justice system. He was a drifter with a long history of serious offenses. In 1972, he had been convicted of taking someone's life in Orange County, California, and received a life sentence. In 1977, while incarcerated, he was also connected to a similar incident in Ohio. His pattern of behavior suggested a serial offender who had harmed multiple victims across different states. The DNA match to Wendy Jo's case added another victim to Richardson's documented history. However, no prosecution could occur because Richardson had died in an Ohio prison in 2013, 3 years before the DNA match was made. He had spent the final decades of his life incarcerated for his other offenses, though he was never charged during his lifetime for what he did to Wendy Jo. Detective Richard Bengtson, who worked on the cold case resolution, expressed satisfaction at being able to provide answers to Wendy Jo's family. He noted that it was wonderful to finally give the family some closure about what had happened to their loved one nearly 50 years earlier. Investigators continued to review other unsolved cases from the areas where Richardson was known to have been active. His pattern of predatory behavior suggests there may be additional victims who have not yet been connected to him. The identification of Richardson in Wendy Jo's case demonstrates how DNA evidence can reveal connections between seemingly unrelated crimes, even decades after they occurred. For Wendy Jo's family, the resolution came too late for many who had known and loved her, but the identification at least provided an answer to the question that had haunted them for nearly half a century: who was responsible for taking Wendy Jo from them? The case also highlighted a troubling reality about serial offenders. Richardson had taken multiple lives across different states, yet Wendy Jo's case remained unsolved for nearly 50 years while he was eventually caught for other offenses. Had DNA technology existed in 1968, he might have been identified and stopped before claiming additional victims. The delay in resolution meant that Richardson served his life sentence for other crimes, but was never formally held accountable for what he did to Wendy Jo. How do you bring justice when the perpetrator lived under multiple identities? Terry Lynn Hollis. In November 1972, in Torrance, California, a young girl named Terry Lynn Hollis went for a bike ride near her home. She never returned, and her body was later discovered, having been subjected to a terrible attack before her life was taken. The case devastated the community and launched an intensive investigation. Because the victim was a minor, specific details about the crime are not appropriate to include. What can be said is that biological evidence was collected and preserved, providing hope that someday technology would allow identification of the perpetrator. The investigation in 1972 pursued every available lead. Interviews were conducted throughout the community, and anyone who might have had contact with the victim was questioned. Despite these efforts, no suspect could be identified, and the case eventually went cold. For 47 years, Terry Lynn's family lived without answers. Her parents passed away, never knowing who had taken their daughter. Her brother Randy grew up carrying the weight of this unsolved tragedy. In 2019, Parabon Nanolabs applied genetic genealogy techniques to the preserved DNA evidence. The analysis identified relatives of the unknown profile, and investigators built family trees that pointed to Jake Edward Brown as the likely perpetrator. Brown had used multiple addresses and aliases throughout his life, making him difficult to track. His criminal history following Terry Lynn's death included narcotics offenses, robbery, and 2 incidents involving attacks on women. This pattern suggested a dangerous individual who had continued offending for years after what he did in 1972. Brown had died in 2003, 16 years before the DNA identification. To confirm the genetic genealogy findings, investigators obtained a court order to exhume his remains from Arizona. DNA extracted from his body matched the profile from the crime scene, providing scientific confirmation of his involvement. Torrance Police Chief Paul Irvine described the case as the kind of situation nightmares are made of. The identification brought closure to a case that had haunted the department for nearly 5 decades, though it came too late for Terry Lynn's parents to know who had harmed their daughter. Terry Lynn's brother Randy expressed mixed emotions about the resolution, stating that he only wished their parents were still alive to see this day. They had carried the burden of not knowing for the rest of their lives, passing away before the breakthrough came. Investigators reviewed other unsolved cases from the era to determine if Brown might have been responsible for additional incidents. His use of aliases and multiple addresses suggested someone trying to stay ahead of law enforcement, and his later criminal history demonstrated a pattern of harmful behavior. The case illustrated both the power and limitations of genetic genealogy. The technology could identify perpetrators decades after their crimes, but it could not restore the years lost to grieving families or hold deceased perpetrators accountable in a courtroom. The final case would reveal a connection between the perpetrator and the victim's family. Naomi Sanders. In February 1973, 57-year-old Naomi Sanders was found in her Vallejo, California apartment. She had been attacked and strangled, the victim of someone who had entered her home and taken her life. Naomi worked as an apartment manager, a position that brought her into contact with many people in the community. The investigation in 1973 collected biological evidence from the crime scene. Interviews were conducted with residents of the building, Naomi's acquaintances, and anyone who might have had reason to be in or near her apartment. No clear suspect emerged, and the case eventually went cold. For more than 40 years, Naomi's family waited for answers. Her nieces grew up knowing their aunt had been taken from them, but not knowing who was responsible or why. In 2014, DNA technology allowed scientists to develop a genetic profile from the preserved evidence. This profile was entered into databases, but matched no one directly. The case required additional breakthroughs to identify the perpetrator. Between 2018 and 2019, Parabon Nanolabs applied genetic genealogy techniques to the profile. The analysis identified relatives of the unknown individual, and investigators built family trees. Remarkably, when they obtained DNA from a potential relative's son, it matched the crime scene profile. This led them to Robert Dale Edwards. What investigators discovered next was disturbing. Edwards's father had known Naomi Sanders. This connection suggested that Edwards may have had access to information about Naomi through his family, potentially identifying her as a target through this acquaintance. The familial link added a troubling dimension to an already tragic case. Edwards had an extensive criminal history, including assault, theft, charges involving domestic situations, and assault with a deadly weapon. He had even been convicted of attempted ending of life, demonstrating a pattern of dangerous behavior that stretched across years. His record painted a picture of someone capable of what happened to Naomi. Edwards had died in 1993 from an overdose, more than 25 years before the DNA identification. He had never been a suspect during the original investigation, and there is no record of him being questioned in connection with Naomi's case. His death meant no trial or prosecution could occur. Naomi's nieces, members of the Kattinger family, expressed that those who remembered Naomi could now feel a sense of closure. The identification answered the question of who was responsible, even if it could not explain why Edwards targeted Naomi or hold him accountable in a court of law. The family expressed hope that Naomi could now rest in peace, knowing that her case had been solved and her attacker identified. For more than 46 years, her death had remained a mystery. The genetic genealogy breakthrough finally provided the answers her family had sought for nearly half a century. Investigators reviewed other unsolved cases to determine if Edwards might have been involved in additional incidents, but found no confirmed links. The connection between Edwards's father and Naomi remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case, suggesting that proximity and familiarity may have played a role in making her a target. The Sanders case demonstrated how genetic genealogy could uncover not just the identity of a perpetrator, but also unexpected connections that shed light on how victims may have been selected. The familial link between Edwards's father and Naomi suggested this was not a random encounter, but potentially something enabled by information Edwards had access to through his family's acquaintance with the victim. For the investigators who worked on these cold cases spanning more than 50 years, the resolutions represented both triumphs and limitations. Technology had advanced to the point where identification was possible, but the passage of time meant that traditional accountability through trials and imprisonment was often impossible. What remained was the ability to provide answers to families who had waited decades, to put names to the perpetrators who had escaped justice during their lifetimes, and to close files that had remained open for generations. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.